I'm hearing that Bosch has some new firmware out for the intrusion panels.
That's right. It's version 3.11.
And why is that important, and why does that matter in the grand scheme of things of intrusion panels?
So in the old days, if you wanted to give your customers a new feature, you would sell them a brand new panel. So new features meant a new panel, new hardware, but installed panels, those never got new features. They just had the old features from the time they were installed until the time when they were replaced. So now what Bosch wants to do is Bosch wants to give new features to existing customers on a regular basis. So we're rolling out new firmware every so often, major firmware updates on a regular basis, and then minor bug fixes in between that.
So if I'm a field person or a dealer and I'm working with Bosch Intrusion panels, where do I find this firmware?
So the new firmware will always be on the product page of the panel. You download it from there and then save that onto your computer, and then RPS will have a firmware update wizard so you can easily update a firmware on an existing panel.
So with any new firmware release, I gotta believe that there are a bunch of new features, and I've heard about camera integration and intrusion, and now cameras and intrusion are being integrated together. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that works?
So the camera integration is, I think, the biggest improvement that this firmware release gives you. We already have camera integration on our panels, and that's probably one of the most unique and one of the most useful features that Bosch has. When you integrate your video into your intrusion, you have the ability to solve security problems that nobody else could solve, because if you have your analytics looking at a scene, you can have intelligent intrusion detection, not just motion detection or movement detection. So you have your cameras on the network, you have the intrusion panel on the network. You can send signals from the camera to the panel based on analytics rules you set up, and you can have up to 8 analytics rules per camera. And we used to have up to 16 cameras. We've now expanded that to 59 cameras. So I'm going to show you where that is in RPS. Okay, so in RPS, you go to panel-wide parameters. Panel-wide parameters over here. Sorry. You click panel-wide parameters. You used to have IP cameras. You used to have IP cameras 1 through 16. Now you actually have IP cameras 1 through 59, and you can add your connected cameras, your all your camera information. Not only that, but we actually have this thing. This is actually really cool. You can now use the camera as an input. So you can have contacts or motion detectors or some kind of close contact device on the input of the camera, and you can use that as an input for the actual panel itself. So you can use that as a point. So let me show you how to do that. You go to points, see, points over here. You go to point assignments. Sorry. You go to point assignments. I'm going to expand that. So you go to point assignments. The first 8 points are always going to be on void points. But you go to an assignment, and if you have a camera and that camera has an input, you can actually click an IP camera and use that as an input. It's grayed out now because I don't have a camera connected to this particular panel, but you can have up to 2 inputs on each camera. You use that as a wired input, which is actually cool. Nobody else has that.
So let me ask you about a scenario involving integration. If I'm an end user and I have a Bosch intrusion panel installed in my building with cameras, Bosch cameras, and somebody breaks into my building at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the intrusion panel starts to alert people, are you saying that the recording or the video could possibly be activated once that alarm goes off and send me an email that something's going on in my building?
You can do all sorts of things. You can have the intrusion panel trigger the camera and make the camera do stuff. You can have the camera trigger the intrusion panel, have the intrusion panel do stuff. But yeah, you can have the camera do video verification. You can have you can trigger the camera and have the camera send an email with a video clip or a snapshot through the intrusion panel out to notification target.
That is awesome stuff. And you know, as an end user and maybe our dealers, I think that's most helpful to talk about those scenarios when it involves the integration of intrusion and video. And I also understand with this new firmware that there are templates that make programming simpler. Can you talk about that and maybe show us how that works?
So if you have a type of point, you generally want to have it act in a particular type of a way. And if you have a lot of the same type of point, you want them all to act in a particular kind of way. For example, you have lots of smoke detectors. You'll want the smoke detector to do the same sorts of thing. And you could go in by hand and change every single feature and every single response type and whatever, you know, for every single point in the system. But if you have a lot of points in the system, it gets long, it gets tedious. So what we did was Bosch put together templates. We call them point profiles. So point profiles are a way of having a certain type of point all act in the same way. So if you have a lot of front doors, you assign every single front door with the front door style point profile, and they all act in the same way without you having to go in and change everything. And obviously you had a way of customizing all your point profiles, and we also had a bunch of empty point profiles, so you can create your own point profiles. But we have a bunch of different profile types. We have a bunch of different point types that share specific behavior, and just to make programming faster and easier on the installer, we have a bunch of different point profiles. Now, in the new firmware, we actually have 4 new point profiles. I'm going to show you those point profiles. So you go to point, then you go to point profiles, and you got 63 point profiles to play with. The first 32 were defined in old programming, but now you have point type, response type, circuit style. You double click it and it gives you the profile, and it allows you to select the point type. So now we have 4 new ones. We have panic, which looks like that, and that's what you would use for a panic button. We also have 3 different styles of environmental profiles for environmental sensors. So we have water, we have high temp, and low temp. So you can use those for environmental sensors, any kind of third-party environmental sensors, and there are lots of good ones on the market today, and you could use those phone profiles. So it's it has some settings that are pre-programmed, and you can always go in there and customize them if you want to have a specific style of response.
So let me go back to my building scenario, and I'm the end user again, and I have 10 fire doors, and I want them to be closed 24 hours a day, and if somebody opens that door, I want a local siren to go off. So can I create a template that's called fire doors and program them all the same at one time,
Sure.
of those 10 points?
Sure, we have the ability to add lots of different custom point profiles, so you can create whatever point profile you want, but there are already a lot of different predetermined point profiles. So for a lot of scenarios out there, you are very likely to find a point profile that already does what you want it to do.
So the benefit for a Bosch dealer would be time saver?
Time saver. If you're a programmer, instead of having to add all these features to every single point by hand, and instead of having to figure out the best combination of features, you can just select a predetermined point profile and use those features.
That's awesome. So let me ask you about something else. So building owners, dealers, right, we're in the business of securing properties and making sure things are safe at a property. What about my security system itself, the panel Is there any type of security surrounding that?
So the new firmware has a feature called Passcode Security that will lock out the panel if you enter a certain incorrect code a certain number of times. Say you have somebody who's bored and just wants to try to mess with your panel and try to figure out your code. In theory, they could just start entering codes and entering codes at random until they figured out what a code was. Obviously, it would take a long time, but it's not impossible. They can actually guess something.
Right.
So now we have Passcode Security. I'm going to show you how that works. So you go to User Configuration. You go to Passcode Security. You click on Keypad. You enable it, and now you can determine. You can tell the panel how many failed attempts will trigger the Passcode Security feature, and you can show it how long to lock the panel out for. So you can lock the panel out for a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or what have you, and you can tell it how many times you can enter a code incorrectly before the panel actually does that.
Nice. And and with this new software, we all, have been involved in situations where visitors come to the building once, a truck driver comes once, maybe every 6 months to make a special delivery. Is there anything in the new firmware that can limit a temporary visitor to gain entry?
So we have a one-time code now. So you can create a code or a bunch of codes, just have them in the programming, and then they'll work one time, and then they'll expire. So let me show you how to do that. Okay, so you go back to User Configuration, you select Authority Level, and now we have One-Time Disarm. So if you enable One-Time Disarm by hitting E, it will allow that code to work one time. So any code that's assigned that particular authority level will only work one time until it and then it'll expire. So you can go into the programming, obviously, and change it back and refresh it if you wanted. But what you can do is have a series of codes. You can just seed it with 50 or 100 one-time use codes. You give them to HR or to the maintenance department, whoever needs it, and they could give somebody a one-time use code without having to worry that they're going to reuse it and enter when they're not authorized to do. So, back in the day, you could give somebody a key, or you could leave somebody a key under the mat or whatever, but then if that key got lost, or if somebody copied that key, they could reuse it. Your security's compromised. This way, if you have reason to let somebody into your building one time, you can do that without having to worry that maybe they'll come back again.
Well, you know what, Ari? Sometimes people hear the word firmware and it's like, oh boy, this is going to be technical, or this is going to be too difficult. But you've explained this very clearly in the English language, and I can't thank you enough for your time. If anyone needs any further help or information, please don't hesitate to email us, support@midchest.com. Thanks, Ari.